Back in early 1970s, I'd been out diving off of the coast at Port Adelaide, and when we were coming back we called in at Torrens Island, and I saw an old bottle heap there, or not a bottle heap, there were relics of glass, shards of glass everywhere, and I came across this, and it looks insignificant to the general public, but to me it was quite fascinating because it's a free-blown gin bottle that predates Adelaide by quite a few years, decades, 2 decades. And it got me very interested in the question of who were the first Europeans to travel the coast of South Australia. We know that the Dutch and Portuguese were there in the early 1700s and earlier because of Noit's archipelago. But I began to research. I went up and down the coast of South Australia and Kangaroo Island. I'd been there very early in life as a kid on the old Karata, fell in love with the island. And it was Kangaroo Island that gained my interest because of the history that had been written about the first settlers on Kangaroo Island. And they were generally described as ex-convicts, escaped convicts, kidnappers, murderers, pirates, and we can go with that if we initially. Then as I researched more, I started to get a picture of these fellas who'd been misrepresented over a long period of time, and I might say by very eminent historians. And what had happened was that the initial descriptions that were in of Bass Strait and Kangaroo Island, and also across to Western Australia, the initial descriptions came from reports in the 1826 Tasmanian papers, and also the Sydney, the Australian, as it was called then in Sydney, and the Hobart Town Gazette. And these people were always called pirates and murderers, as I said before. And when I got to read about individual characters, a completely different story emerged. They were intelligent men, they were all literate. Yes, they had Aboriginal wives, and in a lot of cases they weren't kidnapped. They were actually women who willingly came with them. And the misrepresentation never changed through to the 1900s, even though one of them, George Bates, lived until 1897. But going back to where it came from initially, was there were reports from people that when I did thorough research into it, had never been to Kangaroo Island, and it was hearsay about what was existing. And eminent people, and I use the word eminent, George Augustus Robinson, the protector of Aboriginals on Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land as it was then, his reports were all second hand. There was a fellow called Skelton, a captain, who made scathing remarks about the murderers at Kangaroo Island. Never went there. Another chap called Smith, who was in jail in South Africa, escaped and came across and became I suppose you could say again, eminent, but not so eminent. And his reports were that he came to Kangaroo Island, this is about 1822, and sailed up a river that was 16 miles long. There's no such thing on Kangaroo Island. And so what I did in my research, I went back and read everything I possibly could, including diaries and things that were factual that give one a good insight into what was going on the island at the time. And gradually this picture began to emerge that, and as I said, eminent historians even up to 1950, 1960 were using falsified reports from 1820 from the newspapers, and had never thought about going back and checking the veracity of them. I got to thinking, did the Dutch get as far as Kangaroo Island and the two Gulfs, or were they on the far west coast? And did more research, and it started me thinking about a novel about missing galleons, etc., that were off the coast. We often find them off the coast of Western Australia. And so I wrote a book based on a ship that existed, which started back in the very early 1700s, and then I go forward, a ship is wrecked on Kangaroo Island, then I go forward to the 1800s when the Europeans, sealers and whalers, come across the wreck. And it was a novel called Nemesis, which we can see here. And we got to the stage that I had a film offer on it. We got right to the stage of having a contract. It was the same people who did Wolf Creek. It became a very big seller in Tasmania and South Australia, the book, and I was given a chance to be a guest speaker at the 200th anniversary of Georgetown, and as one of the speakers over there, I gave a talk on the book, but more on about the sealers and the whalers, how their life had been misconstrued. And one of the other guest speakers was the Dean of Edinburgh University at the time. He was an Australian. He suggested strongly that I write the true story. And that's what got me into writing this new book called The Forgotten Men, a 400-page document about this misrepresentation of history. When I was researching this book, it really became clearer and clearer that even through until the 1950s, that there were still authors, scribes and commentators who were misrepresenting what really went on in Kangaroo Island. And again, it was from this recycling going right back to 1826. What I did in the book was I went back to where these erroneous reports came from and then gave a comparison of what really went on at the time through shipping records, etc., etc. And that becomes very important in creating the picture, the true picture of these men on Kangaroo Island, but also a little bit later in Victoria as well, because exactly the same thing happened in Victoria, where people they claimed that they were the first settlers, where the sealers and whalers received no recognition whatsoever. Now, it gets to the point then that the sealers and whalers, what they did, and we'll call them sealers, and they were after kangaroo furs and harvested salt on Kangaroo Island. It was their information in the 1820s that was sent back to Governor Darling in Sydney that led to the creation of the colony of South Australia. But we never hear these sealers getting any credit for what they did. A fellow called Bates, George Bates, gave some information to one of the early sealing motherships about the existence of a large lake, which was Lake Alexandrina. Now, Darling then sent Sturt down on a trip of discovery down the Darling or down the Murray, and he discovered Lake Alexandrina, already known before he'd got there. And Sturt never mentioned once that Bates and Nat Thomas and Henry Wallen, knew that this lake existed. Sturt talked about the Aboriginals being fearsome. Bates and Wallen and Nat Thomas were all friendly with the natives who were there. Now, I'll go on with this Nat Thomas and George Bates and Henry Wallen. Wallen was the head of what you might call a gang of sealers. And once a year, the ships would come from Hobart and Sydney, and all of the sealers would gather with their skins, with their salt, kangaroo seal skins, wallaby skins, etc. And of course they would trade or barter in goods. And often it was, as is described in the book, it was slop clothing and generally rum in hogsheads. And then they'd come back 12 months later and the same thing would occur. Now these men on the island, as I said, they were described as convicts, and murderers. There is not one record, official record, of any murder on Kangaroo Island before 1836, before settlement, what you call British Colonial Settlement. All of these men were literate. They had Aboriginal wives because you couldn't get an English woman to, English-Irish, call it a European, a white lady, to go and live on the island and do what the Aboriginal women did. The Aboriginal women on Kangaroo Island weren't generally what we would say kidnapped or abducted. They were often traded, as was the a common occurrence in the days, where it was a kangaroo dog or seal skins or meat or other things, and some of them came quite willingly. There were cases where some of the Aboriginal women had been kidnapped and traded amongst the white people of the day, or the people on the ships. But generally, the chaps on Kangaroo Island looked after their Aboriginal women to the point that today there are still Kangaroo Islanders who come from one of the first families of Nat Thomas's descendants are on the island today. And he had a lovely wife she actually outlived Truganini. And when she died in 1872, I think it was, he remarried a white woman, but there was a reason behind that. It was for land claims in Kangaroo Island. There were no Aboriginals on Kangaroo Island. They had been there a long time before, but had died out, and it was called the Land of the Dead. So the mainland Aboriginals had a fear or a dread of Kangaroo Island. But then, when we go deeper into reading lots of excerpts from people who were there, the Aboriginals on Cape Jervis, or Cape Jervis, call it whatever you will, they actually came across and stayed with Wallen and Nat Thomas and Bates, and then went home again. It was there's quite a famous lady, a lady who married William Walker about 1826-27. She took Bates and a couple of others to find out what had happened to Captain Barker, who was killed at the mouth of the Murray. Captain Collett Barker was in the Isabella and had been sent to determine whether the River Murray outlet or whether it flowed into Gulf St Vincent. He had been up the Gulf and found that it wasn't so, discovered the Port River Inlet, climbed Mount Lofty, and travelled down around Cape Jervis to where the mouth of the Murray was, and disappeared, much to the consternation of all on board the Isabella. They saw smoke signals coming from the mainland nearby, and the ship's crew went ashore and found Kalinga, or Sally as she was known, and she told them of the sealers on Kangaroo Island who could assist in finding out what had happened to Barker. So Sally, her father Natala, an uncle, he was known as King Condi, her father, they went to see what had happened and determined that he'd been speared by natives from the area. And that was often said that he disappeared without trace and nobody knew what had happened, but it's documented the names of the Aboriginals who killed Barker as well. And so years, even following that, years later, people such as Sturt said that it was the fault of the sealers and whalers on Kangaroo Island that caused Barker's death because of the animosity or the ongoing fighting. But Bates, Wallen and Nat Thomas were all very good friends, or friendly, with the native people all around Lake Alexandrina and at the Cape Jervis as well. So it's quite strange. That's the whole problem with the history of South Australia, is that these people have never been recognised for their relationship with the Aboriginals, their knowledge and understanding of the coast, which led to the settlement of South Australia, because their information was sent back to New South Wales, and from there the South Australian Company was developed. And I think they should. They were all men who were literate, could write. In the book I show passages. Manning Clark described Henry Wallen as depraved as any person there ever was. Henry Wallen could recite any passage from the Bible and was a very generous man, never drank, or he did after he was thrown off his land at Cygnet River, and there's a story within that even in itself. Cygnet River is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to, and you can see why Wallen and his offside of William Day and their Aboriginal wives lived there. It's a beautiful spot, but the South Australian Company usurped their property, and that was the end. Wallen then started drinking, so then he was described forever and a day as a drunken pirate. But these people, as I said, were literate people, very knowledgeable, and it was their information that led to the settlement of South Australia, and they should be recognised as such. A Ramangiri Aboriginal lady from Cape Jervis called Kalinga, or Sally as she was known in English, she'd actually been with the Sealers and Whalers across to Western Australia in 1826 and was well known, could speak English, and her and her uncle and her father travelled between Kangaroo Island and the coast, coming and going, which dispels the myth of abduction and kidnapping and fighting amongst the Aboriginal people and the white settlers, call them settlers, the Sealers. She became very important as far as the early settlers went, because in 1836 she and one of Henry Wallen's wives went in search of a group of people off the Africaine who thought they would walk from one end of the island to the other, not knowing what the island's like. And anyone who's been over there knows it's a big island, and it's covered with trees and brush and scrub. Now, the reason I mention that here is that the settlement of South Australia by the South Australian Company and others, there's maps that show what the island was like. And in these maps it's got fertile soil, wooded plains, and one of the main descriptions comes from a fellow called George Sutherland, who said that he'd been on the island sealing in the 1820s, and he may well have been, but when he said that he was there from January to August, but when you read the shipping records, etc., about the ship that he was on, was only there for 2 weeks in January, was then back in Tasmania, and then back in Sydney, and was sold in June by the owner. So all of a sudden, we can call them lies, or where the myths came from, start to emerge, because it was his discourse or his information that led to the South Australian Company settling on Kangaroo Island to start with. Now, as I said before about them, or they knew about the coastline from way up to the west to Nat Thomas. It was actually said that he knew every nook and cranny. He was such a good navigator. And when you think that they went all that distance in just open whale boats, it's amazing what they did. Now, when the settlers first got there, of course the sealers didn't know anything about it, and Nat Thomas and Wallen and George Bates have said, it's useless. Why are you here? This is not the place. They told them about the Adelaide Plain. And it took quite a period of time before the South Australian Company understood, what they were talking about, because there's no water on the island. And they still weren't recognised as important people. It was as though Samuel Stevens, the manager of the South Australian Company, it was as though he wanted to claim all the credit for settling in South Australia. Then would you believe that in later life they still referred to them as pirates, etc. In later life, Samuel Stevens was up on a murder charge, so it's good to cast stones. What I also found out at that stage was there was a comparison with Victoria with what happened in South Australia. The claimants to Victoria, to being the first settlers of Victoria, the main one, I suppose when we look at what Faulkner did and Batman, and then we come across to Portland, which was still considered today to be the first settlement in 1834. When Henty came across, Dutton had been here about 6 years previous. Henty was still in England, and yet Henty came across. His father was in Van Diemen's Land in Tasmania, and it was only a book written by Learmonth that backed Henty all the way. Dutton was ignored, and Dutton never sought recognition. Henty and Faulkner, they were the two that laid claim. Batman was sort of disappeared off into the distance, even though Batman was recognised. They were the two that laid claim to being the first settlers. And it's interesting that Faulkner was actually here in Victoria in 1804, as the child of convicts who landed at the first settlement down near Sorrento. Now, there's another interesting facet here that shows how today, Melbourne to Sydney, we think an hour in a plane. We don't have any understanding of what the distance was like in those days, because they'd come by boat, they were gone for months and months at a time. Now, there was they had a very good understanding of how they wanted to settle Bass Strait, because Kangaroo, they knew what was happening in Van Diemen's Land, and they'd been in Phillip Bay in the early 1800s as well. Well, they sent a surveyor down who actually surveyed Port Phillip and said that it was unsuitable, and the Yarra River said it was unsuitable for settlement in 1804. The same chap was sent to survey Kangaroo Island and reported back that it was just a sandy island, not good for anything, but he surveyed Kangaroo Island in Bass Strait, a little island that's only a few miles long. So there was a lot of misinformation that even came about from there, and it was another 30 years before Melbourne was finally recognised. Now, it's interesting when you look at, we say that South Australia was settled by the British. Victoria was basically settled by Tasmanians. And there were so many instances of the Tasmanian, I use the word Tasmanians against Van Diemen's Lands, the landholders over there who wanted land in Victoria. And one of Batman's mates kindly offered to take all the land between Port Phillip and the River Murray, take it off the hands of the governorship of New South Wales. And but again, there were sealers and whalers all along the coast. They also had bark gatherers. They used to shoot swans for down. There were people up and down the coast. But again, there has been no recognition of this. Henty said that he was the only settler between Twofold Bay and Western Australia. That was his claim to fame, and yet we know it's completely wrong. And so what I've done in the book is I've gone back and given, and I don't criticise, I sort of will have a statement and I'll say this is what is a comparison to it. You choose yourself as to what's right or wrong. When we talk about myth, it's very interesting that the last so-called full-blood or pure-blood Aboriginal woman is always known as Truganina. She had lots of different names as well. But there were two Tasmanian pure-blood Aboriginal women who lived on Kangaroo Island who outlived her. But you're never going to change that myth. It's always going to be Truganina, who's the last of the pure-blood Aboriginals. But again, I give proof of it here within the book. There is, I think, now, 200 years later, I'm coming into bat for these people that should receive recognition for what they did. Dutton in Victoria, because he was one of the first. Henty talks about how he was the first person to create agriculture. He actually took Dutton's spuds to grow them. He mentions in a diary. Learmonth talks about Dutton only being a whaler or a sealer. Henty was involved. That's what got him here to start with as well. So there's so much information that we need to separate and then take as fact as to what really happened in those days. And it seems that the people who barked out the loudest, got the claim to fame. So yes, Portland, 1834, the first settlement, but it's not quite like that. They'd actually grown produce. One of the early sailors, captains, had grown produce on one of the islands in up around Phillip Island back in 1803. Came back a few years later just to check how his crops were. So he certainly wasn't the first farmer. There's a lovely story about Sally Kalinga. She was married to William Walker, and she was walking through town. And this lovely description is that this is one of the early settlers saying that this lovely Aboriginal woman with curly hair and wearing a long possum skin coat walked up, and they didn't know that she understood English. and they commented on how nice she looked, and she turned around and told them they were gammon, which in those means that, you know, a bit cheeky. But here was one woman who, she's quite an amazing lady, lived for quite a while. Henry Wallen served on quite a few ships, came out from England in the early days and served on quite a few ships, and he was on one of the ships that went to New Zealand. And there's quite a long story about this, where their boat was attacked by the Maoris, and Wallen was very, very lucky to escape with his life, because they killed and ate. It was a terrible story when you read it. It was published in the Hobart Town Gazette in the 1826 of this sealing trip, and also they used to get flax from over there as well. How the whole ship was just about taken by the Maoris, and it turned out to be a terrible slaughter. When you read the story, it's it's very sad, but that's what it was like in those days, I'm afraid. So Wallen then came back, and it makes you understand why he settled on Kangaroo Island, because there were no Aboriginal people there. He could live off the land. He lived in a wonderful spot at Cygnet River called Two Wells by them, and had his mate and a couple of Aboriginal women. They grew crops, and they had some animals there. And so after what he'd been through, to come and live on Kangaroo Island in about 1818, I think it was, that he settled there. So that massacre in New Zealand must have been around about 1818 as well, because he came straight across after that, but it was published later in the Hobart Town Gazette. George Bates actually absconded from a ship that called at Kangaroo Island, but he was a free man as well, never a convict. He did get in a bit of strife here and there, but he lived until 1897. Quite a well-spoken man, very literate. Henry Wallen's letters show that he's very descriptive writer, a very literate man. Nat Thomas could only sign with a cross, but he's the man whose family still live there today. He was a wonderful sailor, lived at Antechamber Bay, the most beautiful place, looks back over the coast of South Australia. And his building's still there. The early part of the building has been built around, but what you'd call the first residence of South Australia. George Bates ended up living in Penneshaw. There's photographs of him sitting outside of his old stone hut. But it's a story that I can tell against our family, is that convicts weren't allowed into South Australia. And because these people were considered to be escaped convicts or runaways, and because they had Aboriginal wives, that might be one of the reasons they were never accepted into society. My great-great-grandfather came to South Australia in 1838, I think it was, on a ship called the Siren from Tasmania, and we only found out about, I suppose, we always had this idea behind us that he was a ex-convict, a ticket of leave man, and one of the South Australian historians just contacted us late 6 months ago and found his records. We couldn't find them anywhere, and he was an ex-convict, and in the 1872 table or photograph of all the early settlers of South Australia, there's my great-great-grandfather with his big bushy head and that, who was an ex-convict, which is quite amazing that, you know, he ever got recognised. So there we go. Here's these three fellas, or William Walker, who came along a little bit later, but still before colonial settlement, who never received recognition for everything they did. But there's my great-great-grandfather, who's an ex-convict, who's looked upon and recognised as one of the early settlers. So it is quite ironic in a lot of ways. There was a species of dwarf emu on Kangaroo Island that was first sighted by Flinders and then by Bourdain and others, and it was quite common across the island when they first arrived. By the time of British Colonial Settlement in 1836, it had disappeared, and the sealers were blamed for its demise. A similar species of dwarf emu lived on King Island and Flinders Island as well, different to the larger mainland species. And the same thing happened there, where it was considered that the sealers wiped them out. There was no doubt that the sealers had an effect on it, because it was described as being in their larders quite often as a food source. But in the last 20 or 30 years, a research scientist at Pelican Lagoon on Kangaroo Island, Mike McKelvey, received a call from overseas, and there was a thought that it may have been affected by the avian fowl virus. And people might wonder, well, how would that get there in the early days? But Bourdain actually dropped off pigs and fowls at Penashore, strangely enough what they also called Hog Bay. And this scientist from overseas had a theory that this could have been these pigs carry the avian fowl virus, and the roosters and fowl did as well, but pigs carry it without any effect to the detrimental effect to them. Mike went out and found some bones, and they were sent overseas and tested, DNA tested, and sure enough it was found they had the avian fowl virus present in them. So yes, there's no doubt that the emu would have been affected by the sealers and whalers, but it just goes to show that they were actually condemned for wiping it out, but it just goes to show that there's a lot more to to these things than what we generally believe. The kangaroos on Kangaroo Island were also, by the turn of the century, they were thought to be extinct as well. And even when I was a young bloke back in the 50s, they said that there were no kangaroos on Kangaroo Island. But they've made a comeback. They were actually killed for food and also for their skins. The fur trade was huge. Wallabies never came near extinction because there's so many of them, but the furs of wallabies, seals and kangaroos were actually traded for many, many years. Kangaroo and wallaby were actually still traded up until the 1950s. There was still trapping going on. But now, again, they have made a great recovery and are everywhere across the island. When Flinders first arrived, and the same with Bourdain, when they first arrived on the island, and this was a pointer to them being the first Europeans to visit the island, they both stated that how common they were, the emu and the kangaroo, and how tame they were, where they could walk among them and kill them because they were naturally had been at sea for a long time and they needed a food source. So it definitely shows that there'd been no other visitors to Kangaroo Island before those two first got there. Looking back on the development of this book, it's been an interesting journey because of what I found when researching. The research has shown that there's been a lot of misinformation over the years. As I previously mentioned about the Aboriginal women on Kangaroo Island, how generally they were well treated by the men that owned them or took them as partners or wives in some instances. Yes, there was some kidnapping that went on with amongst the sealers and whalers all along the coast. It was well known and well described also, I might add. But the Aboriginal women on Kangaroo Island were definitely well looked after, and they've got their ancestors who live on Kangaroo Island today. The Aboriginal women, who were the last of the true full-blood Tasmanian or Van Diemen's Aboriginal. You'll never change the myth of Truganini being recognised as the last of the full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal women, even though it's recognised that two Aboriginal women, full-blood Aboriginal women, outlived her on Kangaroo Island. That has been well documented. The recognition of the sealers and the whalers, the work that they did assisting in the establishment of South Australia as a colony, I hope will now gain some recognition because they deserve it. It was their information that led to the settlement of South Australia. Same with Victoria. We see where people claim to be the first settlers, yet the sealers and whalers were there a long time before the so-called now recognised settlers. I hope that this book also opens up the erroneous reports that have been recycled and used as fact over the years. I have not said who's right and who's wrong. I've given factual information that came from the era, and it allows the reader to assess it themselves to see what is myth and what is fact. I have had a great reception from historians and other eminent people who, as a document, and I would love to see this book become part of the education system, especially in South Australia.